Welcome to this week, and this week we look at the follow-up to the previous documentary that we watched. The title of this one is called The Released, and The Released talks about the role of inmates with mental illness in prison and jail and what happens after they are released. The transcripts of the show are available here, and this website also contains a lot of information on the topic, additional videos, and some readings if you're further interested in it. So the topic of mental illness and violence often captures the attention of the general public. So it's always interesting to know what happens, particularly in prisons that are overcrowded. The rate of incarceration has decreased for the last 30 years or so in our society. However, the hiring of staff has not increased, so there's still a very low ratio between the number of staff and the number of inmates. And the conditions within a prison can often increase the symptoms of mental illness for inmates who are vulnerable to this. Inmates are, when placed in prison, are classified. The classification process can last a couple of days. They'll stay in sort of temporary dorms, and they will be screened for all sorts of different things, such as physical health conditions, mental health conditions, education status. There may be some other screening that takes place, such as gang affiliation. If someone is in a gang, they'll take tattoos. If they have tattoos, they'll take photos and document which tattoos. There could also be situations that arise that if someone has a history with another inmate who is already incarcerated, they have to be separated. For example, if they'd been involved in some violent interactions on the street or before incarceration. And so the screening process coming into prison is quite elaborate. And the goal is to identify inmates who are at risk for all sorts of issues related to mental health, also suicidal behaviors, and also behaviors of violence. There's some overlap in terms of inmates with mental illness and violence. Mental illness doesn't necessarily make someone more or less violent. However, when placed in a situation where a person has trouble reading the signs and symbols, it can begin with kind of not being in place when there's a count. When officers count you, you may not be able to follow basic rules, directing these people towards mental health care if they need it, and really focusing on people who are potentially vulnerable or could have their safety compromised in some way. We do know from research that inmates with mental illness, because they can experience issues of disorientation or depression or even outright delusions, are more likely when they act out, whether it's a part of their mental illness or not, they tend to filter into certain parts of a prison. This might start with what they call a step-down unit, which is inmates who have certain issues or problems to do with aggression or having trouble, let's say, following their basic hygiene, having showers or interpersonal problems in a dorm. And so they can often filter into dormitories that are specifically designed for inmates with mental illness. And of course, if they act out with full violence and aggression, they are more likely to be placed in solitary confinement or complete isolation. This can go up to what we call lockdown cells, in which inmates are in a cell for 23 hours of a day. So they get 1 hour outside by themselves on a yard, and for 23 hours a day they're in a cell by themselves. We do know that this type of placement in solitary confinement or other forms of isolation do increase the symptoms of mental illness. Inmates with mental illness do much better even with problems when they're around other people who can supervise, interact with them, and engage with them. And one interesting thing about solitary confinement, you would have to say that the most severe punishment that a criminal justice system completes is obviously the death penalty, or capital punishment as its correct term is. But a close number two in a lot of ways is solitary confinement. So if we think that the worst punishment that can be given to an inmate is death by through the state, through the government, number two is placing them in somewhere by themselves and away from other inmates and other staff. In individuals and inmates with no mental illness, this can lead to problems. But for those with a mental illness, this can really exacerbate whatever issues they're already dealing with. Another issue that happens on the flip side of violence and acting out with aggression is being victims of these harassments. In most cases, it's not some sort of outright violence. Prison are not as violent as the media tends to make out, but an inmate with a mental illness may be more victimized through things like bullying, such as other inmates stealing and eating their snacks, harassment. These types of things might be more common with inmates if they can't necessarily defend themselves or react in the right way. And by defend themselves, I also mean verbally. Not everything is a fight, but defending themselves meaning recognizing who's doing something and standing up to them. If there's some side effects due to medication, this can also kind of delay their response. And also the effects of certain mental health conditions like depression. A person may be less likely to be aware of their surroundings and to be able to defend themselves. So there's a range that we prevent prison victimization. In the prison system, the two sides of the one coin is usually on one side you have a director of security and security staff. So in this orientation, we're thinking more correctional officers, and their goal is to make sure that contraband is not in the prison, such as weapons and cell phones, that things like the gates and the bars and the security processes are all followed. So we're thinking of ways of confinement and basic safety and security. And on the other side of the coin, we usually have some director of programs and services, and a therapy staff, which could be mental health staff, as well as physical doctors of physical health, dentists, a whole team of different people, nurses, social workers, and also school teachers. So in programs and policies, we think about inmates who continue their education, maybe to get a GED, or in some cases to engage in a college program. And so we kind of do a two-sided approach, where one side is the hard, fast line of security, and what complements it is giving inmates an option towards therapy and potentially beneficial programs. There's an old story that for corrections that the first lion tamer, so in a circus, the people that will come out and do shows with wild lions or lions that they would do a show with, the first thing they were always told, and it's a lesson I always think of, is never stand in front of the exit. And the reason for that is if a lion freaked out or reacted with aggression or violence, you want to give them the opportunity to take that exit and not be trapped in the cage with them. So giving them an exit in terms of some way to avoid aggression and attacking. In a similar way, I think of programs and policies in a much similar way. The exit that you don't want to block is this roadmap towards programs, policies, education, job training, other sort of interventions that can maximize inmates' experience in prison and give them the best opportunity for when they're released. When the exit is blocked, in other words, when there are not programs, not adequate therapies, not adequate education programs, you're essentially increasing the risk of aggression and violence. So when we look at shows like Lock Up, we'll see that there's a large media influence that happens when we watch prisons, and their media is very very apt to do visuals that are kind of sexy and dramatic, let's say. So things like an inmate who has a mental illness who refuses to leave a cell, and they'll do what's called a cell extraction, where officers have to go in with a shield and they video the event, and they take the inmate down, and then they restrain them. That is good for television purposes. In this class and in other classes, we'll learn about things like doing time, the effects of boredom on being incarcerated. So these are important things to remember, that the media representations are not accurate, because they tend to leave off things that are rather slow, boring, but the slow and boring things actually document the lives that inmates really face. So when we do respond to violent incidents, when correctional officers and correctional staff have to intervene, there's a number of different mechanisms. The prevention-based ones tend to deal with teaching inmates anger management or other therapies that perhaps focus on the mental illness itself and to remedy the mental illness. And it moves to more reactive responses, which includes a physical intervention and physical restraint. One thing that correctional officers will tell you is, actually two things they will tell you. The first one is that because they don't have weapons, that is by a gun, they don't have firearms like police, that their best weapon is their mouth. In other words, correctional officers have to be very good at using verbal judo, using effective communication techniques, and working with inmates as people and mutual respect in order to get what they want, to get them to move and do things that they want. This is an important recognition. Most people in general society don't understand correctional officers, they don't know them, and correctional officers tend not to talk about their work, and so they're often an invisible or forgotten population. However, their job is very crucial in a prison. And so the first thing they will tell you is that their effective strategy has to be verbal. And the second thing they will tell you is that at any point in time that inmates could take over the entire prison. Inmates often number correctional officers by 1 to about 100, and if they wanted to and coordinated it correctly, they could take over a prison. This is very different to on the street, where a police officer will respond with backup and may outnumber a suspect, one suspect to 5 or 10 police officers, and the police officer is armed up to lethal force. In this case, correctional officers do not have lethal force, unless it's at the gate, perhaps where they have weapons at the guard tower, but within the facility itself they do not carry firearms, and they're often outnumbered 50 to 100 to 1. So it changes the dynamic in which they have to react to violence, and it also encourages us to increase education and training for these officers, so when they address inmates with a mental illness, they can react appropriately to get the best outcome possible. If you'd like to read an additional case study on the topic, there's a book by Jack Abbott, who was an inmate. It's called In the Belly of the Beast. It's an interesting book. I will say that it is outdated, that our correctional system doesn't do these brutal, torturous things. This was, way back in 1965 until 2002, but most of his experience in the 1970s. But he gives a very good insight into the effects of isolation and lockdown and punitive punishments on his existing mental illness, and how it actually led to an increase of symptoms. So Jack Abbott was born in 1944. And he went into foster care at an early age. He experienced abuse and ill treatment, and by 16 he was in a juvenile detention center and reform school. He was incarcerated, and he committed suicide at the age of 58. The title of the book, In the Belly of the Beast, and the cover is on the right, and a picture of Jack Abbott is on the left. The book is a series of letters that he wrote that had to do with the way he was beaten, incarcerated, abused while incarcerated. Like I said, this, if it happens now, would lead to a massive lawsuit. But what's interesting for purposes of this class is this book really assesses his real time, because he was writing it real time, or right after his incarceration periods in isolation, and he would write down his experiences. So he'd be locked in a cell for a period of days, and not have a lot of access to people, and no stimuli, and he would have delusions or see things, and he would write them in a series of letters, and that became the book. So this is something, if you'd like to read on a similar topic, to understand how these symptoms manifest. As I mentioned, it's outdated. A more recent viewpoint would look something like this. A isolation cell would actually not have a bunk bed. You would be in that cell by yourself. And it's about a 6x9 or 6x10 cell with a toilet, a sink, and a bed. Often in isolation, the inmate will not be in a routine orange gown. They'll be in an anti-suicide, or actually what's technically called a suicide-resistant gown. That is a gown that the person can't rip up to commit suicide, because isolation will increase mental health symptoms or mental distress in most people. And so they are placed in special clothing. They won't have shoes, because the shoelaces could be used to self-harm, and they could be in this claustrophobic environment if placed on lockdown up to 23 hours a day, and 1 hour they'll be taken out into the yard for some recreation, then brought right back in. Recreation will be by themselves, and all food for those other 23 hours will be brought by an officer and handed to the inmate through the door. Sometimes therapies that will happen, the therapist will have to sit outside the door. And there's a range of reasons that these cells are used. Some for violent inmates, inmates who have threatened to harm or have harmed a correctional officer. High profile inmates sometimes have place there just out of a need of space, such as those who are famous in the media, or government officials, etc. But this is the general dimensions of a prison cell, and the claustrophobic and isolative nature of the cell can be seen here. So while you watch the released, some of the questions to consider is, the overarching question I'd like you to think about is it appropriate to house inmates with mental illness in jail or prison? So is this the best and most appropriate place for them? We know that through deinstitutionalization, these inmates were moved out from asylums and placed in, they were supposed to be placed in community care, and they ended up, a number of them, in prisons and jails. So we have two options: community care / asylums, mental health hospitals, and we also have jails and prisons. One topic that comes up sometimes, and you can do more reading on this topic, but people tend to be fascinated by it, is the not guilty through legal insanity defense. And these inmates, is actually a rare defense. It's not used very often. Sometimes it can lead, even though the person is found not guilty, it can lead to long-term sentencing in a mental health hospital where the person is not able to be released. So they could actually serve more time in a security facility, even though it's not a jail or a prison, than if they just went to jail or prison. That's one reason that it's avoided. Another reason is that it requires documentation in the court process to show that the person had a mental illness leading up to the crime. In a number of cases with inmates, they may not have gone to school, may not have interacted with a therapist, may not have had a therapist at juvenile detention, foster care, or any of their life course. They've never really been diagnosed with anything. So even if they have a mental illness, it can be difficult to prove that this mental illness was there for a long time or severe enough leading up to the crime. So it's a defense that's not used that often, and it's not really what people think that the person kind of gets away with the crime, their sentence is usually even more severe than if they just did not get that sentence and ended up in jail or prison. So back to the question, is it appropriate to house inmates with mental illness in general in jail or prison? If you think yes, this is the best place for them, what programs or policies do you think should be added to jails and prisons to give us the best outcomes for these inmates? So we do know that they need to receive more specialized additional programs and specialized policies. So what do you think you would add to make us have the best outcomes for when these inmates are released? Now, if you don't think that they should be placed in jails or prisons, where do you think these inmates with mental illness should be placed? What, in your mind, what would an alternative setting or a different type of way to do this look like? One that provides justice for the victims and for society for the crimes committed, but one in which the aspects of mental illness can be addressed. And then a big overarching question at the end for this documentary is, how can we best prepare inmates with mental illness for release back into society? Most people think that prison is a place that our offenders, once sentenced, are just sent to and they kind of just disappear. 95% of all people sent to prison will return to society at some point in time. That means 5% will die in prison, but 95% returning means most of them will come back into our society. And they don't come back evenly. They tend to disproportionately live in low socioeconomic neighborhoods and can impact those neighborhoods because a lot of these inmates are returning into kind of clusters of areas and neighborhoods. So what is the best way if we consider prisons and jail as a social investment? It's taxpayer money, so if we're investing in these inmates, much like we're investing in education for students, what type of inmate do we want returning to our society? If we don't offer programs and policies for inmates with mental illness, if they have increasing symptoms, if they have more anger, more violence, more aggression, what type of inmates are we preparing to come back into our society, and is there a chance that they will continue to recidivate, which means commit crimes and be sent back to jail and prison, which is expensive, and also ethically, if we don't prepare inmates for release back into society, are we just leading to more victimization for people in our country? So these are some questions to think about more personally as you watch the documentary. Here's some information taken directly from the PBS page. As I mentioned, it follows from the previous documentary called The New Asylums. So this is 5 years later in the same system as before, the Ohio prison system, which has a reputation of being an advanced, well-organized, well-structured system. And it follows a large number of these offenders that we met last time. It says that typically offenders are given a bus ticket, $75, and 2 weeks of medication if they are inmates with a mental illness. And we know that in most cases, in 2/3 of cases, inmates with mental illness who are released, within a year and a half, they are back in jails and prisons. So the rates of our success are actually rather low. For inmates with no mental illness between the age of 19 and 25, about 9 in 10 will return back to prison. So our success rates are very low. Chances are this is because of a lack of effective programming, a lack of comprehensive intervention in prisons, and certainly a lack of effective mental health care when you consider the low number of staff in a prison, the high number of inmates who have a mental health condition. So the challenge is considerable, and in this documentary we follow a subset of inmates that you may have seen in the previous documentary, The New Asylums, and we'll see how they experience leading up to release and following release from prison. Here's one example about Lynn Moore, who's in the documentary, and he suffers from schizophrenia. He also has a history of drug and alcohol abuse, which we've seen is often a way to treat mental health on the street. Um, it's a self-treating mechanism. He's been arrested 20 times, and his charge is fairly typical of a person with schizophrenia who's having a crisis. He broke into a house looking for Osama bin Laden, and he had bottles and bricks, and he was incarcerated. So he's had trouble in shelters and halfway houses. So after release, he'll do well on medication, but then have something like failing a breathalyzer test and will be asked to leave a shelter. And you can tell that his cycle of not taking medication, falling back into symptoms of mental health, particularly a schizophrenic break with reality, relying on drugs and alcohol. So it's a constellation of homelessness, drug and alcohol abuse, mental health issues that all leads to this cycling back and forth in prison about 20 times. The psychiatrist who works on outreach teams, that is, teams that take people released from prison and transition them back into society as they move from a life of being incarcerated to non-incarcerated. Mike Unger says the realities of psychiatric treatment for those coming out of incarceration is that it is non-existent or very poor. In other words, if they have received some sort of medication and they are given some sort of help while incarcerated, they'll find that that disappears when they're released. They'll often find their mental health care by having a crisis and either brought back to jail or prison or brought into a hospital for some sort of problem, physical problem or mental health problem. As he says, this isn't a population that's going to come with their planners, their organization, and their compliance with their medications and keep them in that perfect little medication box as they live behind a dumpster somewhere. So the reality is the connection between the criminal justice system, which is police, courts, and corrections, often faces this gap when it re-enters the welfare or community health system. And this is a gap in the system after release where inmates with mental health issues are very vulnerable and they can easily fall between the cracks, leading to increased cost for society and also ethical issues as they harm themselves or potentially harm someone else. So enjoy this documentary. I think it's very effective and a really interesting one. Every time I watch it, I learn more. And that's it for this set of slides. Thank you.